They felt, along with a lot of other religious denominations, they felt it was really extremely important to have well-trained educators in Christianity, in the Bible, so forth, to come out west and to teach. And that not only involved the American Indian reservations. President Grant's policy that he instituted in the early 1870s divided the reservations to certain religious denominations. For example, the Crow Nation, at this time, their headquarters was right over by Livingston. The Crow Nation was run by the Methodist Church. The idea was, well, with Christian leadership in the distribution of goods, the purchase of goods, the treatment of the Native Americans on the reservation, they were liable to get more of a square deal. That was the theory. One of those, at the same time that the Methodist Church got the Crow Reservation, they decided to build a new church in Bozeman. And one of those who laid out a huge donation was Nelson Story. You knew I was going to find a way to sneak him in here, didn't you?
Of course, of course.
Nelson Story, he wasn't a religious guy. He didn't attend church, but he was smart enough to make a good donation to get in good with the Crow Reservation. That's just one example. And from there on down the line, they had just as much corruption, thievery, and so forth and so on. But it was well intended. In 1887, Pastor Robert Stevenson, he opened the Presbyterian Academy here in Bozeman. The Presbyterian Academy was housed in what was Nelson Story's roller rink. He built a roller rink downtown, and after running that for a couple of years, remodeled it, sold it to the Presbyterian Church so they could use that as an academy. And according to this reverend, his school would be an alternative to public education system that he described as patronized by recognized infidels and saloon keepers. The churches that did send out their missionaries, their teachers into the American West, thought that this was a good way, an excellent way, to keep youngsters, young people out of mischief. They looked at the American West as, in most communities, you had saloons, you had gambling halls, you had brothels, or hotels for single girls, if you wish. And that this was going to have a really bad effect on the youth if they didn't have some alternatives. Now, granted, in places like New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, you had the same thing, brothels, gambling houses, and saloons, obviously. But according in the view of the hierarchy of these churches, at least in these larger cities, people would have alternatives to those sinful dens. Out in the West, with so much territory, such a sparse population, there were very few alternatives. At least that was the view. Very few alternatives, to a life of debauchery. Going back a couple of decades from the 1880s, quote from the Helena Herald. This would be July 4th, 1872. We have in our midst an educational institution which is an honor to its founders and a credit to the metropolis. We refer to the Female Seminary of this city, known as St. Vincent's Academy, which was established in 1869 under the auspices of the Catholic Church. 5 Sisters of Charity, having come to this far distant territory, to carry out the good work. Soon after their arrival in Helena, the sisters circulated a subscription paper, and by this means raised sufficient funds to build the handsome and commodious seminary on Ewing Street. The academy that was completed during the summer and in the fall of 1869, was opened under favorable circumstances, upwards of 25 students being in attendance. The school continued to prosper under the able management of the sisters until that number has more than doubled. It is now regarded as one of the best institutions of learning in the Western country, and young ladies can now have no reasonable excuse for going east to obtain what is commonly called a finished education. We are decidedly in favor of patronizing home institutions and would like to see them liberally sustained and encouraged by the people of this territory. Well, in the early 1870s,
Hold on just one minute.
oh, okay. Sometimes you just click the mouse.
Just click the mouse to advance the slide once.
Okay. My house, I just bounced the mouse off the walls. But anyway, Lyman R. Crittenden was a Presbyterian minister. His first major assignment was in Corrine, Utah. That's kind of a terminus north of Salt Lake, from which a lot of goods were shipped into Montana. That was his first assignment. He decided to come to Montana Territory, to come specifically to the Gallatin Valley to teach. And he brought his family with him, in particular his daughter, Mary G. Crittenden. This young lady here, that's him on the left, that's Mary, his daughter, on the right. They came here in the early 1870s and decided that with his health, however, he did have some health issues. So he decided once he got here, instead of being a regular pastor, he was going to start an academy and to teach young people at this academy. Now, keeping in mind what the Helena Herald had to say about St. Vincent's, he, the good Reverend Crittenden, he wanted to educate those people as an alternative to what he called that nunnery school in Helena, where they received a misguided education from the Sisters of Charity. Others refer to the, well, getting ahead of myself a little bit, he did start an academy here in Bozeman. It was placed at Main and Tracy, Tracy and Olive, at the corner of Tracy of Olive in the Good Templars Hall. And then later on it was moved to a cabin on West Main Street. Crittenden said some of the girls, as I mentioned, some of the girls who perhaps attended St. Vincent's could now join this academy. And that actually did happen. One of them was Jeanette Trent, the younger sister of Ellen Trent Story. Okay, she attended St. Vincent's Academy, and then once this got going, she transferred back a little closer to home. The staff of this early Presbyterian Academy, and again, when it first started, it was for both boys and girls. The Reverend Crittenden was the superintendent. His daughter, Mary Gertrude Crittenden, the principal. Miss Ella Aylesworth was the assistant teacher, and then Mrs. Crittenden as the matron and drawing teacher. Courses studied for both girls and boys, classes in reading, writing, history, geography, arithmetic, and drawing. Tuition, $6 a month. Those days are gone. Plus additional charges if you took extra courses. When they first started, there were 12 enrollees, and in 1873, it bounced up to 21 students. And that included Matt, Ed, and Lina Alderson, and Billy Frazier, who went on to gain some notoriety here in this area. The Panic of 1873 was just that, an economic panic. And it caused a recession. Money became extremely tight. And word came to the Crittendens that there was a spot out in the middle of the valley located in the small little town of Hamilton. Hamilton, if it were still standing, would be to the west and southwest of Manhattan by just a couple of miles. One of the things that attracted the Crittenden family to Hamilton to relocate their academy is the fact that, well, yeah, it had barns, it had a stable, it had a general store, but it was missing something. There was no saloon. This, they felt, would be a really, really good place to relocate the academy. And somewhere along the line, when they decided to do that, they made the academy strictly for young women. In those days, the attitude pretty much was, the guys are really busy working, okay? If you're going to have good Christian homes, if you're going to have good children raised the right way, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it would fall on the shoulders of the woman of the house. She would be much more the example than, say, the guy would. So a lot of these academies, St. Vincent's up in Helena, the first major academy in Montana Territory, and now this Gallatin Valley Female Seminary in the Gallatin Valley, they kind of geared themselves toward that goal, working primarily, with young women. So once they relocated out there, the Ladies Missionary Society of the First Presbyterian Church of New York, that was one of the overseers, high-level overseers of this missionary effort. They made some donations and were very pleased that they, here in the Gallatin Valley, had found a spot here where they could teach the true and effectual opposition to the insidious teachings of the Romish sisters. You get an idea that the Presbyterians and the Catholics didn't share the same park for a church picnic. You know? But this was one of the primary motivations. Even Mary Crittenden here saw the school, the academy, established out there as a barrier to the pernicious influences of Catholic teachings. Well, so the Presbyterian Church had about 40 such academies spread throughout the American West. There were some in the Southwest, some even further west, closer to the Pacific Coast. To my knowledge, this one here for years was the only academy, only Presbyterian academy that was established in Montana. Students who boarded, now they built a couple of buildings, put up a couple of buildings. Crittenden got some donations. They put up a couple of buildings and enough to build a crude dormitory for those who wanted to board at the school. They could pay $20 a month, but those who only needed to attend the classes and stayed at home, boarded at home, they were able to do it for $4 a month. However, the curriculum was the same as I outlined earlier. But if you wanted to take French, German, and instrumental music, that would cost you extra. Mary Crittenden noted at this time what these things meant: the opportunity for young women to be educated in a Christian academy. What these things meant in a time when there was scarcely, any available amusement but dancing and card playing, when the Sabbath had but little to distinguish it from other days, in a country whose magnificent distances forbade the forming of clubs, benevolent or other societies for mutual benefit or enjoyment, and the homes were possessed of but few means of culture and refinement. Gets back to what we talked about earlier. The attitude was out west, my God, they have no choice. They've got to have something other than the saloons and brothels. And she went on that it can hardly be realized in our present state of advanced civilization. Well, they set out to change that. In the first year, 25 girls enrolled. Most were between the age of 12 and 17. Let me see here. Again, this is a picture of the Crittendens. People in the 19th century, when they had their photos taken, they didn't smile. I don't think smiling for photos started until Teddy Roosevelt came along. That might have been the trigger. This was one of the original buildings. This was taken in the 20th century, but this is one of the original buildings. Don't know who the ladies are who are standing by the building, but again, it was taken in the early 20th century, as you could tell, but this was a combination dormitory and teaching building, classroom building. A typical day at this academy: breakfast at 6 a.m. You got 30 minutes to eat, girls. Breakfast at 6 a.m., family worship at 6:30, scripture and lessons beginning at 9. Noon hour, you got the noon hour for lunch and what they call chit-chat. So if you had things to talk about, then was the time to get them out of your system. Lunches most day consisted of bread, butter, and bullberry jelly. I'm not sure what bullberry jelly is. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, but that was what the lunch was. So it's not like they were having prime rib or lobster thermidor by any means, because running on donations, being a Christian organization, constantly trying to hold costs down. Then after lunch, back at lessons at scripture until 5:30. Then you would have a gathering at 5:30 at the table, recreation until 7. Then you were allowed to study in your rooms until 9, and then end the day at evening worship. Sundays were pretty much as you would expect. Sundays were a day off, a day of rest, and that was pretty well enforced. There was one young guy, a farmer, who lived near the academy, and he said that whenever he worked on a Sunday, if he had to drive his wagon somewhere to pick up something or what have you, he made sure he went completely out of his way around the academy. He didn't want the good Christians at the academy seeing him working on a Sunday. He didn't know what the repercussions of that just might be. In 1875, the school was relocated to what was called the Drew Place. This was closer to Central Park, okay? Closer to the main road that went from Bozeman up to the Three Forks and then branched off from there, say, to Bannock or up to Helena. This moved it closer to the road. There were more settlers in that area, and it allowed more girls who were attending classes to walk to school, okay, as opposed to having to pay the extra money for boarding. The Crittendens at this new location, they built a dormitory, adding that to an already existing log house and barns that were there. They had room for 12 boarders and nearly 24 day school students. And one of the other things that was built at that location was this, the stone church. This church, again, built by the Reverend Crittenden, paid for by donations throughout the valley and some volunteer labor. This church sat out there until 1973, but then it was torn down, quote unquote, for safety reasons. Kind of unfortunate because it was quite the historical building, but again, you can see where the church is. Back over here where some of the classes, a good portion rather, of the classes would be held. Courses that were added to the curriculum once they moved out here. They already had a pretty good full line of courses. It was a heck of an education, probably more thorough than what you would find in some of the public schools. Courses that were added: botany, astronomy, algebra, and philosophy. Parties at the school, yeah, you guessed it, they were strictly forbidden. However, local farmer Willard Harris, years later, noted that there were ways, where there's a will, there's a way, there were ways for the cowboys, the local farm hands, local cowboys, to latch up with the girls attending the Gallatin Valley Seminary. I'll just quote him. They would get one of them to go up to the matron or house mother, meaning a cowboy to go up to her, and take her out for a ride. It was agreed how long she was to be away. They would just get out of sight and there would come these cowpunchers out of the woods from all around, leading a saddle horse with a side saddle on it, and they would go up there and get a girl and take her out riding. And that was the way they worked that. It was quite a scheme because it was all understood that the guy that had taken the matron out with him, they knew how long he would keep her out, and then they, of course, would all have to be back in the house before she showed up, and they always were. So they got that down pretty much to clockwork. Other things also that the seminary liked to do was to give some special programs, in particular choral programs, singing programs. The Riverside Grange Hall, that's another building no longer standing, the Riverside Grange Hall. I wished I could describe it, but I don't know exactly how it looked because there's no pictures of it to my knowledge. But anyway, it would host various programs, and it was a good draw for a lot of people around the valley, and actually people from Virginia City and Helena would also come down to see these programs, primarily singing programs that were put on by these teenage girls at the Gallatin Valley Seminary. One such event had 200 people. Program opened up, you guessed it, with a prayer, and then a greeting glee sung by the 21 girls. The Avant Courier says the girls kept good time, and the singing that would be hard to beat by that number of old folk. There were other musical pieces and a play entitled Circumstances After Cases. One of the girls who participated in this, one of these programs, special programs in the spring, she recalled years later that one local farmer volunteered to come pick these girls up at the seminary and take them back over to Hamilton to the Grange Hall so they could put on these performances. And in one particular instance, he came, picked up about half a dozen girls. They climbed into the wagon. They got so far, stuck in mud. They all hopped out of the wagon. They even helped push him a little bit. He could get the wagon going. Then they got back in the wagon. He would go a little bit further, stuck in mud again. Does this sound familiar? And I don't know the condition of the girls' clothes when they got there, after having to bail out of the wagon several times to help push it to the hall where they were going to have the entertainment. But you can pretty much assume would have been in tough shape. This is another angle of the Gallatin Valley Female Seminary. And up above is one of the teachers. That would be Mrs. Ella Aylesworth Edsel. At the time she was a teacher, of course, this was before she had married into the Edsel family. But again, she was indeed one of the teachers. Getting back to what I was just talking about, the lady who was a young girl, one of those in that wagon, continuously mired in the mud. She said later that we were taught in those days to laugh at discontent and carry on. And so they did. You can imagine they weren't whining about the situation at all, what with the educational background they had. I should mention also with the church, the stone church that you just saw, that the Reverend Crittenden made, it was made strictly out of stone and concrete. The total cost was $1,800. And as I intimated before, it was all paid for by donations. And what's interesting, a $50 donation, which is a pretty good piece of change in those days, $50 donation came from the Anthony family. They were Roman Catholic, and they still donated to the female seminary. And a lot of other religions did the same thing too, or I should say people who were members, excuse me, who were members of other congregations did the same. Even though there might have been, you know, and I guess maybe we've all experienced it, there may have been a little bit of a rivalry, say, between the Methodists and the Presbyterians or the Episcopalians, what have you, but people who belong to these churches, they donated to this cause because they did see the opportunity for these young women to get an extremely valuable and, if you will, wholesome education. Mary Crittenden, in 1878, to be specific, June 26th, she married one Edward Davidson.
Oops.
Sorry, Mary, I didn't mean to. Wait, let me click the mouse.
There are no more pictures.
I think that's it, John.
You're right, okay, all right. She did get married at the seminary. I forgot, this is the end of the line. I got a 2-for-1 type photo. She was married right underneath that tree. Again, that was in 1878. And due to the customs of the time, Mrs. Crittenden, or Ms. Crittenden, she was forced to step down as teacher at the school. This was another one of those traditions. This was another one of those expected outcomes from the 19th century. You probably know that many of the teachers on the frontier, for that matter all over the country, most of them a great number of them were single young women. If they got married, their teaching careers were over. In those days, the attitude was, the belief was, and this ties into what we were talking about before. Once you got married, ladies, your duty then was to take care of the home while the husband worked. Your duty not only to take care of the home and make sure to cook and clean and sew and so forth and so on, but your duty was also to pay special attention to your children and to make sure, even if it was only in the home, to make sure that they got a good Christian education. That's how it was in those days. Aylesworth, before she married, as I mentioned, Aylesworth, before she married into the Edsel family, was her teacher there. It was the same situation for her. Once she got married, that was it. Well, these two girls got married. These two young women got married. They lost their jobs at the seminary. And so by 1879, that was the end of the seminary. They didn't have anybody else well-versed, in the teachings of the Presbyterian Church, knowledgeable enough about many of the subjects. And again, it was quite an array of subjects, from music to foreign languages to mathematics, so forth and so on. They didn't have anybody else really qualified to pick up the slack and take over. These women who worked at the academy, the Gallatin Valley Female Seminary, they didn't make a lot of money doing that. And it took a certain kind of woman, one dedicated very much to her Christian religious faith. And so with that, the Gallatin Valley Seminary basically disbanded. They went through everything. It was forced, as I say, to close its doors. The books they had, they were given to the Presbyterian College. This is a little bit different. The Presbyterian College at Deer Lodge. They also had a piano that had been donated to them. They took the piano and they gave it to one of the women who had attended classes there, whose husband was an officer at Fort Ellis. Believe that was Mary Hunter Doane, and her husband was Gustavus Doane. He was an officer at Fort Ellis, and she did attend, like I said, she did take classes at the Gallatin Valley Seminary. Years later, Mary Crittenden Davidson, she lived a rather long life. At the age of 89, just before her death in 1934, she looked back with fondness at the Gallatin Valley Female Seminary. The dear old seminary, she said, was a seed-sowing institution. The harvest can be estimated only in eternity. Private education on the frontier. Something encouraged by so many in the community, regardless of religious denomination, Christian denomination. Yes, an alternative to the public schools, but in those days, the education for public schools was just getting some momentum. So if you could afford the tuition, if the girls could afford tuition at something like that, at this seminary, they would get a better all-around education. These seminaries were popular throughout the American West. This one was rather short-lived. There were really no other private educational institutions until 1887, when I mentioned that the Presbyterian College was able to take over Nelson Story's skating rink. Okay, have it remodeled and teach courses there. And then when the Presbyterian College decided to move on, there weren't enough pupils to support it. And Bozeman got the agricultural college. The agricultural college, their first classes were held in a roller rink that had been used by the Presbyterian college. So from there on down the line, you can look, even today, of course, you have the private education. But in those days, the big idea, the big goal, the big hope was to make sure that youngsters, in particular, these young women, behaved themselves, that they got the proper education, the proper Christian education. Okay, the Gallatin Valley Female Seminary was short-lived, so too is my talk.